This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential.
Hey there, this is Erik Rostad. I'm back covering another book. I'm doing another a solo episode here, and this time the book is Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It by Chris Voss. Now, Chris was an FBI lead international kidnapping negotiator. Right now, he teaches at the university level on negotiation skills, and then he's also the founder and principal of the Black Swan Group. And the Black Swan should ring a bell to you. It's a book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and we will be covering that at some point here in the near future. But that was a good one, and in this book, Chris, the author, goes into why he called it that, and it obviously does relate to Taleb's book. So the structure of the book is really interesting and engaging. The first part of each chapter will go into one of Chris's actual stories of negotiating with kidnappers and hostage takers and all sorts of different people. One of the negotiations is actually for a 4Runner car that he wants. So we get into a car dealership, and that one's fascinating. I'll hit on that a little bit later in the episode as well. And then after that, he just takes a lot of the lessons from that particular story and writes about it in the chapter. And it was a good structure in that sense, and then also the lessons that he would pull from a particular negotiation were usually along one kind of strand of topic, but it would also vary in the chapter, and I really liked that. It wasn't like predictable where he was necessarily going. At least to me, there was a sort of an element of surprise in each of the chapters, and just a lot of good tidbits throughout the book. It wasn't like he gave away all the good information at the end, and then you're just kind of wondering when the book was going to end. But no, it's throughout the book you're getting really good negotiating tips, tactics, advice, all sorts of things. So Chris, the author, he at the end of the book he shares his goal for the book, and I thought this was pretty cool. So two different parts here that I'm going to read. If this book accomplishes one thing, I hope it gets you over that fear of conflict and encourages you to navigate it with empathy. And the second thing here, I'm going to leave you with one request. Whether it's in the office or around the family dinner table, don't avoid honest, clear conflict. It will get you the best car price, the higher salary, and the largest donation. It will also save your marriage, your friendship, and your family. That was just a good challenge, I guess, for me. I love to run away from conflict, and not a great character quality, but I've always run away from conflict, and here's a challenge to say don't avoid it, but let's navigate it with empathy, and here's some tools and some skills and advice on how to go about it. So the book starts off at Harvard, which is pretty cool because he's talking to some of the main groups of people who have come up with a lot of the conventional wisdom about negotiating tools and tactics. In fact, the book Getting to Yes, that was the negotiating Bible when I was in grad school and in business school, and it still has high regard in that sense. And he pretty much takes it apart. And the first scene of the book is him at Harvard, and he's negotiating with different professors there, and he seems to win these negotiations, and that kind of starts the book off on, here's a lot of the conventional wisdom, here's my take on some of that, and here's where I disagree. and why I disagree. And I'll get into that in the next section. But I loved that because I in a way, that's kind of a journey I've been having recently of a lot of the books that we're reading for this Books of Titans project have challenged a lot of what I learned in business school. I did business school at the undergrad and graduate levels, and there were just a lot of things that were wrong, a lot of things that needed further study or further explanation. And so this was kind of another cool thing in that regard of certain things being taught in negotiation class as like this is the real deal, and then this book kind of systematically takes a lot of those pieces apart. So in this episode, I'm going to highlight a few of the tips that he gave in the book, some of the more counterintuitive ones, and I'm also going to share a recent experience I had with negotiation. And one last piece here of this first section, I usually talk about who suggested the book or who recommended the book, and no one did in this case. I just started hearing Chris on a number of different podcast episodes and thought, hey, I need to get that book. I think that would be a interesting one to read. So what is negotiation? Chris says it is a process of discovery. It's not an act of battle, but it is a process of discovery. It's a way of learning, a way of gathering information. I liked that. I liked how he presented it that way, and it's maybe a kind of a counter conventional wisdom type of approach to negotiating. And this book was full of that kind of thinking. And I think that thinking for Chris came from two main places. The first, obviously, from dealing with kidnappers and these hostage negotiations. And some of the books we've read for the Books of Titans, they're war books, or for instance, Man's Search for Meaning, the Holocaust. And I think in those types of situations, you get a lot of information when people are pressed to their core. Some lessons come out of those types of things that might take 10, 20 years normally, but you get those lessons in a few weeks or a shorter amount of time because it just the pressure and intensity. And I think the same goes for the hostage negotiations that Chris took part of. He learned a lot of lessons. He saw things that worked and what didn't. And I think he saw a lot of the conventional wisdom tried and ultimately didn't work. And so when he's with the FBI, it's people sharing stories of what worked, what didn't, and they would go on that based on what getting to yes said or more some of the conventional wisdom said. And the other main thing that led to his thinking differently about negotiations comes from our good friend Daniel Kahneman. So Kahneman makes another appearance. We saw him in a ton of books last year. He is the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, and he's known for his work with Amos Tversky and the field of behavioral economics, behavioral psychology, why we do what we do, and how we're not as rational as we wish we were, or how a lot of the academic content would hope that we were for their models. And so he goes into this at the beginning. Kahneman makes an appearance on page 11. And I'm going to read a few things from pages 12 and 13 of the hardcover version, and then how this leads into some of the ways that Chris presents negotiating strategy and tactics. So Kahneman later codified his research in the 2011 bestseller Thinking Fast and Slow. Man, he wrote, has two systems of thought. Systems 1, our animal mind, is fast, instinctive, and emotional, and system 2 is slow, deliberative, and logical. I'm taking myself out of the quote here and to say that I kind of think of system 1 as our unconscious. It's the first thought you have when something happens. Whereas system 2 is more of our conscious mind, like we're aware of thinking about what we're thinking at a given circumstance. So he talks about the system 1 and 2, and then here's Chris again saying, now think about that. Under this model, if you know how to affect your counterpart's system one thinking, his inarticulate feelings, by how you frame and deliver your questions and statements, then you can guide his system two rationality and therefore modify his responses. If you believed Kahneman, conducting negotiations based on System 2 concepts without the tools to read, understand, and manipulate the System 1 emotional underpinning was like trying to make an omelet without first knowing how to crack an egg. So again, this is the very beginning of the book. He channels Kahneman into the discussion, and we see a lot of the tips and tools that he gives from the book, in the book, kind of starting from those two different areas. So I want to, before we end up this second section, just highlight a recent experience I had with negotiation and what I did wrong, and after reading this book, what Chris says that I should have done. So right now we're having some work done at our house. We're at the 1 year point of a new construction, and that's where they come in and do some updates and fix things that have settled and that were just done improperly or incorrectly. And there was one especially egregious thing that we had in our house, and my counterpart at the construction company, I said, my response to him was, "That's unacceptable." And his response is to kind of dig into his position. He gets defensive and kind of goes with the company line instead of really discussing it. So what I did with my response was just kind of shut things down. I said, "That's unacceptable." But what Chris would say is, instead of doing that, respond by saying, "How am I supposed to do that?" And do it in a calm manner, a nice way. So how am I supposed to do that? So if he says, you just got to live with this thing in your house, or we're not going to be able to do that. And I respond, how am I supposed to do that? And so what that does is that brings humanity into it. It brings my humanity. How am I supposed to accept that? How am I supposed to do that? But it also gets my counterpart thinking on how he can help me. Like, how am I supposed to do that? Well, here's how you could do that. Maybe we could help out in this way so that fixes the problem. So just a kind of a subtle thing and a subtle way to respond. But that's one big thing that pops up in this book a lot is asking how and what type of questions in negotiation setting, because it puts the onus back on the person that maybe just said something that you don't agree with. So instead of just straight out saying no, you say, how am I supposed to accept that? In this final segment, I'm going to cover the one thing. So this is the one thing that stuck out the most from the book, the one thing that I want to remember and to have be my key takeaway when I think back to this book. And that is to always rethink conventional wisdom. I know that may seem trite. It's actually been something that has come up in a lot of the Books of Titans books that we've read for this project. And just always be aware of the main line of thinking. For me, especially with this book, anytime I think of negotiation, I think back to that class I had in grad school, and where we learned a lot of the conventional wisdom about negotiating, the most important things to do in a negotiation. We learned terms like BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and ZOPA, and all these different tools and tactics. But they're what everyone uses, they're what everyone knows, and it's been the conventional wisdom for a long time. And so what I really appreciated about this book was a counter to that, and then based on real world experience, but then also based on the findings of Daniel Kahneman. And so really digging deep into what Kahneman and Tversky discovered about our minds, and taking that for his field of negotiation, and seeing what he could learn from that. I think, if all of us could do that with whatever field we're in, knowing how people respond in different ways, and if we can utilize that information to make our services better, our products better, our negotiating tactics, anything better. That's a really good takeaway for this kind of book. Along those lines, I want to highlight the car section of the book where Chris goes in and buys a Toyota 4Runner. And this highlights some of that conventional wisdom that he goes against. And first is he goes in, he really wants this car. It's a Toyota 4Runner in Salsa Red Pearl, and he wants it. And the sticker price is $36,000, and he wants to pay $30,000. So the first thing in conventional wisdom is, if you want to pay $30,000, then you start at to where $36,000, and your starting number, if you negotiate and split the difference, you would be at $30,000. So in this case, Chris Voss would have wanted to start at $24,000 to eventually, come down $1,000 each point, and then finally get to $30,000. But he doesn't do that. Another thing he does, which conventional wisdom says don't do, is express any emotion or interest in what you're about to buy. So especially with cars, you're supposed to go in there and feign that you don't care about the car, and oh, well, there's other ones out there, I could get another one, even if you really desire this car. And he walks in and he says, he told the sales guy, he goes, "This car is gorgeous." And he said the sales guy just smiled, because he knew that he had Chris. And he said, that beautiful vehicle you just described, that vehicle is $36,000. And so Chris comes back and he says, "I can pay $30,000, and I can pay it all up front in cash. I'll write a check for the full amount. And I'm sorry, I just can't pay any more than that." So he starts at $30,000, and he ends up getting the car for $30,000. And the way he did that is, every time the guy would counter, he would say, how am I supposed to do that? And he said he would ask that deferentially. But the salesperson would go in the back and come back and say, "Well, I can give it to you for $34,000. And Chris would respond, "Wow, your offer is very generous, and this is the car of my dreams. I really wish I could do that. I really do. This is so embarrassing. I simply can't." And so the guy would go back and he'd say, "Well, okay, I can come down a little bit more." And he just kept coming back down and down, and Chris would just keep saying, I just can't do that. I just can't do that. And he eventually got the guy down to $30,000. But I just loved that example, because it wasn't the typical thing that you usually see in the negotiations, and he wasn't abiding by the rules on how you're supposed to act and that sort of thing. So very, very cool example. I mean, the hostage ones are thrilling, and you'll read 10 pages of this hostage negotiation, not even realize it's been 10 pages, because it's really engrossing. So good book in that sense. I wanted to highlight a few other tips and tidbits that he gives in the book for negotiating. The first one is, instead of trying to get a yes from the person, you want to get a "that's right." So if somebody says "that's right," they agree with your point of view. And he says yes is problematic, because there's three different kind of yeses. And somebody may just be giving you a yes so that you get out of their face. And that yes is not going to be beneficial to you in the long run. But if you get a "that's right," that means that you have convinced the person to see things from your point of view. And he even contrasts "that's right" with "you're right." And he says "that's right" is better, because if somebody says "you're right," they're more apt to, again, kind of agree with you, just so that you stop talking, or that you move on from that point. So if they say "that's right," there's likely to be behavioral change as opposed to just saying you're right. And he even talked about that in the sense of if you're talking with a good friend of yours and they have a destructive behavior or a destructive pattern in their life, and you're trying to help them see that and get out of that. They're more likely to change if you can get them to a point where they are saying that's right as opposed to you're right, because you're right is not going to change behavior, whereas that's right kind of sparks something in their mind. So good thing to think about when you're negotiating. The getting to yes thing, obviously the title is you want the yes, but he expands on that and says that's right is going to be better. And the last one here is the importance of listening, not necessarily a tactic or a tool, but overall approach of negotiation, and the importance of listening. But also what surprised me in this book is when they were doing these hostage negotiations, there were multiple people on the FBI listening to the same conversations. So Chris would perhaps be the head or the lead negotiator on with a given kidnapper or terrorist or hostage taker, but there were a ton of people in that van or wherever he was in the office working with him, and they were all listening to the same thing, because he said we all go back to our confirmation bias on things. We all hear things our own way, or the way that we think they should go. And just having all those different people listen and then talk about what they heard, that was one of the best ways that people solved some of these hostage negotiations, is just hearing something that maybe the lead negotiator didn't even hear. So if the FBI has all those people, we need to be cognizant of that in our negotiations to really try to listen well and to be fully present when we're there, because if you're gathering information, it might be a piece of information that's crucial that you want to be sure that you get. So closing out here, this was a great book. I would suggest you go out and get it and try to get it before other people do, because once they know these tactics, you won't be as effective. It was an enjoyable book. I mean, the stories kept things going. It was almost like reading a novel in a lot of situations, but then just taking a step back and getting a lot of the lessons out of these hostage negotiations. So in that sense, just an exciting book, but also great wisdom. And I always think back to the books that we've read for this project, and the ones that have a lot of counterintuitive information or ideas, those are really the ones that stick out. I mean, if it's just conventional wisdom and you've something you've heard your whole life, you just kind of agree with the book and move on. But if it's counterintuitive, it makes you think, okay, why is he presenting it this way? Why is the author saying it this way? Or why does this person approach the art of negotiation in this way if conventional wisdom says to do it this way? Is conventional wisdom right or wrong? And is what this person's saying, maybe there's a nugget of truth there? And I think Chris hit a lot of the stuff right on the head. He captured new ideas in taking what he'd learned from Kahneman and applying it in this situation. So in conclusion, Chris says life is negotiation. We're constantly negotiating. It's with our kids. It's with the person behind the counter. It's high stakes things. It's family. It's everything is negotiation. And if you can have a better mindset going into negotiation, have better tools, better ways to get information from the other person so that you guys can both make a better decision, a better agreement, do it. I mean, this book can help you do that. Just so you know, in the show notes, I'm going to have a link to one podcast in particular that Chris was on. And along these lines of thinking unconventionally, I heard a lot of podcasts where Chris was on those podcasts, and they would ask a lot of the same questions and talk about the book and that sort of thing. But the one I'm going to put in the show notes is one where the person kind of set up a negotiation within the podcast. So I just thought that was a cool way to approach it, and a good way to do something different especially when a lot of people are interviewing the same person. So maybe good to listen to that one after you listen to this episode. But yeah, definitely do recommend this book and think it's a helpful one for you in the art of negotiation. So we'll be back next week with another episode of the Books of Titans podcast. Until then, you can find us on booksoftitans.com, also on Instagram and Twitter. And on the website, check it out. As I mentioned last week, brand new refresh of the website. Every book I'm reading this year, I state why I'm reading it. After reading it, I give a review. I have a section on each page where you can comment about the book, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. And I'm very active on Instagram, so connect with me there at Books of Titans and see what I'm reading. I'd love to see what you're reading, and let's talk about it. And until then, keep reading, keep listening, keep improving, and keep it real.